Hi everyone, this is Professor Smith, and this is going to be an overview for how to determine changes in equilibrium, price, and quantity. Now for this one, you should have my supply and demand personal notes file open and click on the tab that says changes in equilibrium. To understand this one, you should have already reviewed what a supply and demand curve is and what equilibrium is. So if we think about, say, the market for gasoline, as I record this, prices are at a all-time high. So we want to understand what are the supply and demand factors that cause that, and how can we use our graphical technique to explain that price increase. Now to do this, guys, you actually just simply follow a cookbook. The first thing to do is take whatever market and situation that you're analyzing and figure out which, what I'm going to call shifter, is relevant to that problem. Now if you look at the tab right next to it called shifters, click on that. And if you scroll down a bit, you'll notice that I have the major factors that affect demand and supply. So for example, consumer preferences, how much do we like something? If our preferences for something increase, our demand for that product is going to increase. If we learn that a certain product causes cancer, our preferences for that are going to decrease, meaning the demand for that product is going to decrease. So if you scroll down, I've categorized all the relevant shifters. For demand, it's our preferences, how much income consumers have to spend on that good, how the price of one good affects the demand for a related goods. For example, Coke and Pepsi, that's one type of related goods, or peanut butter and jelly is another type. Our expectation of future prices affects our demand for the good today, and the number of buyers in the market. Those are kind of the big five demand shifters. On the supply side, the most important things are the production costs, the expenses, the ability of the firm to produce the goods or services. So if production becomes more expensive or something happens that makes it unable for the firm to produce the good, that's going to affect supply. Okay, so for example, if production becomes more expensive because let's say raw materials or wages increase, okay, that's going to cause supply to decrease because it's now going to be less profitable to supply. Okay, so you can look through the list of shifters, and that's step one of the cookbook, determine the relevant shifter. Step two is to ask yourself, would the demand or supply curve increase or decrease? Now this trips up some students. An increase is always a shift to the right. A decrease is always a shift to the left. Let me just show that briefly. So let's take a look at this demand curve here. It starts at D, it decreases, that's a shift left to D1. An increase would be a shift to the right out here somewhere. Same with the supply curve. If you want to increase supply, you're going to shift it to the right. If you want to decrease supply, you're going to shift it to the left. Okay, now once we have that, all we have to do is simply look at our new equilibrium on the graph and interpret which direction the price and the quantity moved. Let's work through a couple of examples. Let's suppose cold weather hits and makes consumers less interested in ice cream. Okay, so ice cream is the market and cold weather is the circumstance or the situation. And we want to ask what happens to equilibrium. Okay, so literally just go through the cookbook. Step one is to ask which shifter is relevant. Okay, it tells you consumers are less interested in ice cream. That's basically lingo for they don't like it as much. It gives us less utility, less satisfaction, less enjoyment. So that's a preferences change. If I go back and look at my list of shifters, preferences are the number one demand shifter. All right, so that tells me this is going to shift demand. Step two of the cookbook is which direction does the curve shift? In this case, people don't like it as much. They get less satisfaction. So demand is going to decrease, and we now know that's a shift to the left. And step 3 is to literally just show it and interpret it on your graph. Okay, so let's take a look at the picture. All right, at P0, Q0, we could think of that as like the before the cold weather hit. And D1 is what the demand curve looks like after the cold weather hits and consumers don't want the ice cream as much anymore. All right, so demand has decreased. That's a shift to the left. Literally draw it, or if you're looking at a picture, just kind of look at it carefully. And now go to your new equilibrium. That's where my mouse is highlighting right here. All right, so originally equilibrium was here. The left shift in demand triggers a surplus at P0. So the only way that can be resolved is if price decreases. So here's my new equilibrium down here. Now all I have to do is kind of then look at what happened to the price and quantity relative to how it started. Okay, so let's look at my vertical axis. This is the price axis. The price started at P0. If I look at my new equilibrium and I kind of draw an imaginary line to the left, that's my new price, I can see it's lower than P0. Okay, so that tells me that the price of ice cream will be pushed downward, a decrease in price. Now for quantity, again, draw your line from your original equilibrium. It started at Q0. Go to your new equilibrium. Draw, in this case, an imaginary line down. This is our new quantity. This new quantity is closer to the origin, closer to 0. So that means it has decreased. Okay, so that tells us that this decline in preferences for ice cream is going to cause a lower price and a lower quantity. Okay, let's work another one. An economic boom increases people's wealth and income. What happens in the market for cars? Okay, so again, let's take a look at our list of shifters. Boom, there's income. Income is number 2 in the list. Now there are two shifters, we might say. In this case, the good is normal, which means as income increases, your demand for it increases. Okay, so let's take a look at our cookbook. It's a normal good. Income has increased, so that means demand for cars is going to increase, which we now know is a shift to the right. Step 3, just literally interpret your new equilibrium. So you started at this equilibrium right here. That was before the increase in income. Now we imagine the situation of income increasing, and we have a normal good, so that demand curve increases, shifts out to the right to D2. Now simply eyeball the new equilibrium right there at P2, Q2. And I can simply observe that my price has increased. It's gone further away from the origin, so that's an increase in the price of cars. And the total quantity of cars being sold has also increased because Q2 is greater than Q1. All right, let's take a look at a supply example. A freeze in Florida makes orange juice production more difficult. Effect on equilibrium. So again, the market in this case is orange juice. All right, let's take a look at which shifter is relevant. Let's go to our list. Anything that affects production costs, that affects the firm, is going to be a supply shifter. All right, so in this case, the freeze in Florida is going to make it more difficult and more expensive for the firms, the sellers, to make the orange juice. Okay, so that's going to be a supply shifter. Okay, step 2, which direction? Production is more costly. That's going to discourage production because it's going to be more expensive and less profitable. So that's going to cause supply to decrease, and that's going to be a shift to the left. All right, now let's interpret. Originally, you started at this equilibrium here, P1, Q1. Okay, now we imagine supply decreasing. That's going to actually trigger a shortage at the price P1. And if I simply look at my new equilibrium, the price has increased just like a demand increase, but the quantity now has decreased because supply is decreasing, right? So prices have increased and quantity has decreased. That's 3 out of the 4 right there. The fourth one would be if supply increases, and I'm going to kind of let you do that one on your own. Prices will fall and quantity will rise. And if we just kind of recap what we just learned, there's really only 4 primary possibilities. Right? Demand increasing will cause price and quantity to rise. Demand decreasing will cause price and quantity to fall. If I'm confusing anyone now, just take each of these rows here and look at the corresponding graph back under changes in equilibrium, and you'll see that it all aligns. For supply, if supply increases, that's a right shift. That'll cause price to fall and quantity to rise. And if supply decreases, that'll cause prices to rise and quantity to fall. The only other situation that you might ever have to analyze in the real world, sometimes both supply and demand can shift at the same time. Okay. Often in that case, I'm going to kind of just leave this example here for you to read. You'll be able to conclude that either price or quantity moves one way, but you don't have enough information about the other variable to predict which way it's going to move because the curve shifts will sometimes offset each other. That's a little bit more advanced, and there's some good explanations in the book. So at this point, hopefully you have a handle for how to work a supply and demand analysis graphically.